The damp chill of the late October night had seeped into the very marrow of the campus cafe, clinging to the worn velvet of the chairs and turning the air sepulchral. Outside, the rain was not merely falling. It was an angry, visceral downpour that hammered against the leaded panes of the old university buildings. I had been humming a low, tuneless melody while counting the meager tips, the cloying scent of stale coffee and boiled milk my only companions. I was just securing the heavy iron latch of the back service door, a routine task I performed every midnight, when the silence shattered. It was not the familiar sound of a passing patrol car or the distant, drunken shouts of undergraduates. The sound was immediate, brutal, and too close, the splintering crack of wood followed by a gasp that was ragged and involuntary. I spun around, my heart vaulting into my throat. The front door, usually locked and barred by this hour, was violently wrenched open. Framed against the deluge and the dim glow of the gaslight filtering from the street stood a man who did not belong in the quiet, dusty world of academia. He was tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and soaked through, his elegant charcoal suit ruined by the rain, and something far more terrifying, arterial crimson. He staggered 2 steps inside before collapsing against the counter, sending a cascade of sugar packets and ceramic mugs crashing to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. His face, lean and sharply carved, was pale as old marble, and his dark, saturated hair was plastered to his forehead. But it was his eyes that seized my breath. A startling, glacial shade of green, burning with a fierce, desperate intelligence that seemed wholly unbothered by the mortal wound blooming on his side. "Lock the door," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated with suppressed agony. He spoke not in a plea, but an order, delivered with an arrogance I found both infuriating and strangely compelling. Fear, cold, paralyzing fear. I was 21, buried under the weight of student loans, trying to pass organic chemistry, and suddenly thrust into a scene ripped from a pulp novel. Yet, beneath the terror, a deep, reckless instinct flared. I saw the weakness in his stance, the sheen of fever already beginning to glaze those inhuman eyes, and the sheer, overwhelming loss of blood. He needed help, regardless of the darkness that clearly clung to him. I didn't argue. Driven by an adrenaline I hadn't known I possessed, I bolted to the front, fumbling with the heavy bolt and throwing the security chain across. As I worked, I heard the sound of approaching engines and distant, muffled shouts, the sounds of men searching. The man at the counter stiffened, pushing himself upright with a raw grunt of pain. "The back," I whispered, dragging him toward the pantry door, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing jarringly with the metallic tang of his blood. "They won't look here first. We have minutes." He leaned on me, his weight crushing, his heat shocking against the cold of my uniform. We stumbled into the cramped, shadowed space of the pantry. I ripped open a bag of clean linen napkins, meant for tomorrow's brunch, and pressed them violently against the wound on his flank. He hissed, a sound more predatory than human, but did not pull away. The makeshift bandage instantly soaked through. "They will come back," he muttered, his breath hot against my ear as we crouched amongst the sacks of flour and coffee beans. His proximity was overwhelming, a dangerous, visceral current that bypassed logic entirely. This man was a storm, and I was caught in the eye of it. I found myself unable to look away from his face as the silence outside stretched taut, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. His gaze was possessive, assessing, and utterly without remorse. In that moment of shared acute danger, the boundaries dissolved. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was being rapidly overshadowed by a raw, inexplicable attraction to the sheer, terrifying power he radiated. When the coast was clear, I didn't hesitate. I helped him out the back alley, using the shadows and the sound of the rain to mask our retreat. My tiny, book-lined dorm room, usually a refuge of academic austerity, felt impossibly close and vulnerable as I helped him peel off his blood-soaked suit jacket. I worked with a clinical haste, cleaning the wound with whiskey I'd been saving for finals week, my fingers brushing the hard, coiled muscle beneath the torn shirt. The danger outside was forgotten, replaced entirely by the intimate, terrifying danger inside the four walls. He watched me the entire time, those green eyes never blinking, marking every movement, every tremor in my hands. When I finished, the adrenaline that had propelled me through the night crashed, leaving me weak and breathless. He pulled me toward him then, a slow, deliberate movement that negated my exhaustion. His hand cupped the back of my neck, his thumb grazing the sensitive skin below my ear. "Elena Reyes," he articulated, having seen the name on my cafe uniform, the syllables sounding alien and beautiful on his tongue. "You have just incurred a profound debt." I should have pulled away. I should have been disgusted by the blood that still stained the floorboards and the violence that clung to him like a second skin. But the intensity of the night, the fear, the whispered secrets, the desperate proximity had stripped away every layer of my carefully constructed world. He was the darkness I had only read about in Gothic novels, and I found myself leaning into the shadow. The single night that followed was a desperate blur of fire and urgency, an act born less of romance and more of inevitable fate. He was demanding, consuming, and treated my simple dorm room bed like a throne. I was terrified, yes, but also utterly, profoundly claimed by the force of his presence. He was the storm, and I was the wreck he left in his wake. When I woke in the first cold gray light before dawn, the space beside me was empty. The sheets were tangled, the air tasted of rain and expensive cedarwood, and the dull, coppery scent of dried blood was a lingering reminder of the night's impossible reality. Dante Moretti was gone, vanishing as silently and violently as he had arrived, leaving behind nothing but a profound silence, a visceral memory, and a terrifying, unanswered debt. The weeks that followed Dante Moretti's vanishing act were drenched in a sepulchral quiet, a silence far more deafening than the brutal storm that had ushered him in. I tried to anchor myself back into the mundane reality of my life, the weight of textbooks, the acrid scent of formalin in the chemistry lab, the endless, damp corridors of the university library. I walked beneath the brooding, gargoyle-ridden eaves of the old college buildings, pretending the leaden light filtering through the stained glass was the only darkness I knew. But Dante had left a visceral shadow in his wake. My worn dorm room, usually a sanctuary of scholarly austerity, felt corrupted. Every time I smelled cedarwood, or worse, the faint metallic tang of dried blood that seemed permanently etched into the floorboards, the memory of his glacial eyes and the possessive, demanding weight of his body returned. I tried to intellectualize the encounter, classifying it as an aberration, a momentary fever dream induced by exhaustion and shock, but the truth was too immediate, too physical. He was the darkness I had courted, and now the darkness refused to be dismissed. At first, it was subtle, easy to attribute to the stress of midterms and the grueling night shifts at the cafe. A pervasive exhaustion that no amount of caffeine could quell, clinging to me like the October fog. Then came the nausea, a constant, low-grade churning that turned the smell of stale coffee and boiled milk into an unbearable torment. I told myself it was the flu, the inevitable consequence of living in a perpetually damp climate and surviving on instant noodles. But my body, that fiercely loyal engine that had carried me through 2 decades of relentless striving, began to betray my carefully constructed rationalizations. My cycles, which had always run with the predictable precision of a grandfather clock, failed to arrive. I grew quiet, retreating further into the shell of my academic routine, haunted by a dread that coiled tighter each morning. The realization hit me one bleak Tuesday morning, not with a dramatic flash, but with the chilling certainty of a mathematical proof. It was the same certainty I had felt when I helped him staunch the blood, a cold, clinical knowledge that a dangerous reality was unfolding, whether I accepted it or not. I found the plastic box tucked away beneath a forgotten stack of towels in the shared bathroom cabinet. The fluorescent light of the small room, usually so harsh and unforgiving, seemed to intensify the atmosphere of clinical dread. The bathroom was shared by 4 girls, but at 7 a.m. it was mercifully empty. The silence pressed in, amplifying the desperate tremor in my hands. Following the diagram, my movements were precise and robotic. I waited, leaning against the cold porcelain sink, staring at the tiny window in the plastic casing. Time warped. The minutes stretched into an eternity defined by the drip, drip, drip of the ancient faucet. When the first line appeared, faint and undeniable, I felt a sharp, desolate pang of recognition. When the second line materialized, pink and stark against the white background, the air was punched out of my lungs. 2 lines, the silent verdict. The undeniable proof that the storm had not merely passed through, it had left a seed of itself behind. I was carrying Dante Moretti's child. My first reaction was not joy, nor even typical panic. It was a cold, absolute terror rooted in the knowledge of the man I had helped. Dante was not a student, nor a troubled romantic hero. He was the embodiment of the lethal world I had seen reflected in his eyes, a world of blood, of debts, and of permanent shadows. To bring a child into that orbit was unthinkable. To tether myself back to him after I had finally managed to sever the physical connection felt like signing a death warrant for us both. I crumpled the test in my fist, the sharp plastic digging into my palm, a painful anchor in the swirling chaos. I had to disappear. I had to become a ghost before the man who saw every transaction, who tracked every debt, realized I was carrying the most profound debt of all, his lineage. The remainder of the day was spent in a blur of focused, desperate activity. I canceled my classes for the week, claiming a sudden family emergency. I began to liquidate the few meager assets I possessed: my grandmother's silver locket, a nearly complete set of rare Victorian poetry anthologies I had inherited, even my specialized microscope, selling them to pawnbrokers and secondhand bookstores who offered criminally low prices. I accepted every offer. Money was velocity now. Speed was survival. I spent hours hunched over maps of the contiguous states, tracing routes that avoided major cities and transit hubs. I needed rural, anonymous silence. I needed a place where the pervasive, meticulous network of the Moretti family could not reach. I chose a far-flung, forgotten town nestled in the mountains, a place so small and unremarkable it didn't even register on most digital maps. The fear was a constant, icy companion, but it sharpened my resolve. I had one purpose now: protection. I would raise this child in the quiet austerity I had always known, shielded from the violence and the possessive arrogance that defined its father. The debt Dante claimed I owed him was nothing compared to the debt I now owed this tiny, nascent life. As the final, heavy lock clicked on the door of my dorm room, sealing away the only life I had ever known, I clutched the single, worn backpack containing my entire future. I looked back at the university's Gothic spire, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. I was leaving the city, leaving the danger, leaving the memory of the fire. I convinced myself that I had been fast enough, quiet enough. Dante Moretti had sought me out once and failed. He would not find me again. I walked away, a fugitive carrying a secret that was both my greatest terror and my only hope. The university library, that sprawling monument to hushed scholarship, felt like the final, cold anchor I had to sever. The air inside the vaulted reading room was stale and heavy with the scent of aged paper and dust motes dancing in the single, weak shaft of sunlight. I clutched the withdrawal forms, signed, stamped, and sealed, the paper feeling impossibly light, yet bearing the crushing weight of my entire future, now irrevocably rerouted. I slid the envelope through the brass slot of the administration window. The sound of it landing on the other side was a dull, definitive thud, the sound of a door slamming shut on the person I had been. Elena Reyes, the aspiring historian, was officially dissolved. Now there was only Elena Reyes, the fugitive, carrying a terrified, precious secret beneath the threadbare wool of her coat. Stepping out of the library's colossal stone archway felt like crossing a threshold into a future defined by cold anonymity. The late afternoon light was already bruised and fading, casting long, sepulchral shadows across the quad. I pulled the collar higher, adjusting the single worn backpack that held everything I owned, and quickened my pace toward the distant parking garage. Freedom was mere minutes away. I just had to reach the highway, disappear into the mountainous obscurity I had chosen, and never look back. I rounded the corner of the philosophy building, my gaze fixed on the asphalt ahead, when the silence, the blessed, fragile silence I had depended on, was violently annihilated. A low, powerful engine noise ripped through the quiet academic bubble, followed by the sickening squeal of tires on wet pavement. A sleek, obsidian-black car, a predator sculpted from metal and shadow, cut the corner, its grille stopping mere feet from my knees. I froze, my breath catching in a raw, ragged gasp. The driver's window slid down with a silent hydraulic sigh, and the man who stepped out was a brutal, perfect memory given terrifying substance. Dante Moretti. He was taller, broader, and infinitely more dangerous than the storm-soaked ghost who had invaded my dorm room weeks ago. He wore a heavy, dark coat that seemed to absorb the remaining light, emphasizing the lethal elegance of his frame. His face was a study in cold, sculpted fury, his jaw clenched, and those impossible green eyes, the shade of glacial melt, were locked onto mine with a possessive intensity that felt like a physical violation. "Did you truly believe?" he began, his voice a low, perilous rumble that vibrated the very air between us. "That I would not find you, Elena?" The sound of my name on his tongue was a lash. My finely honed plan, the months of meticulous preparation, the desperate sacrifices, shattered instantly. He hadn't just found me, he had waited. He had calculated the precise moment of my desperation and intercepted me at the point of no return. My heart hammered against my ribs, an animal trapped in a cage. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed, the denial weak, thin, and utterly unconvincing. I took a stumbling step backward, my instinct screaming for flight. He didn't move, but the temperature of the air dropped. "Don't insult me with lies. You vanished. You cut every tie. You ran from a debt you knew was due." He took a slow, deliberate step closer, closing the distance, and the terrifying scent of cedar and expensive leather, his scent, overwhelmed me. "There is no debt," I insisted, forcing the words past the paralyzing fear. "I helped you. That's all. Now leave me alone." He scoffed, a deep, humorless sound. "You gave me one night of fire, Elena. You think that is a transaction I simply dismiss? You belong to the ripple effect of my world now." In my desperate panic to escape his shadow, I fumbled the small, cheap satchel I carried, my purse, the worn strap sliding off my shoulder. It hit the cold pavement with a slight, muffled sound, spilling the pathetic contents onto the gray stone. A few coins, a tube of dried lip balm, and the crumpled, telltale plastic casing I had tried to hide weeks ago. My stomach lurched, not from nausea this time, but from pure, absolute dread. I lunged forward, trying to scoop up the test before his eyes registered what it was, but Dante was faster. His large, powerful hand clamped down on my wrist, arresting my movement. The force of his grip was not cruel, but absolute, a demonstration of ownership. His gaze followed mine to the ground. For a long, agonizing moment, he simply stared at the innocuous piece of white plastic half hidden beneath my jacket sleeve. Then, slowly, deliberately, he released my wrist and used the tip of his polished leather shoe to nudge the object into full view. The fluorescent pink line, faint but undeniable, stood out starkly against the cold, Gothic stone of the university quad. It was the visual proof of my ruin. Dante's expression shifted, transforming from cold fury to an immediate, visceral shock that drained the color from his face, leaving only the fierce, inhuman green of his eyes burning intensely. He crouched slightly, picking up the test with the tips of his fingers as if it were a fragile bomb. He examined the two lines, his brow furrowed in a terrifying concentration. When he looked up at me, the air crackled with a new, infinitely darker intensity. The possessiveness I had sensed before was now multiplied tenfold, a terrifying focus that pinned me in place. "Is this child mine?" His voice was no longer a rumble, but a dangerously low command, cutting through the silence of the dying afternoon like a knife. "No," I whispered, the lie tasting like ash. "It's not yours. I found it. It's a mistake." He didn't even bother to challenge the absurdity of the denial. He simply dropped the test, which landed soundlessly on the pavement and straightened to his full, imposing height. The fury returned, colder and more absolute than before, laced now with a terrifying sense of claim. "You were running," he stated, his eyes raking over my backpack and my withdrawal papers. "You were running." He didn't wait for a response. His hand shot out, wrapping around my arm above the elbow, his grip a vice that bruised instantly. I gasped, struggling futilely, the fear turning into a desperate, feral fight for survival. "Let go of me!" "I won't go with you," I pleaded, kicking out, but my movements were inconsequential against his sheer power. He was an immovable force. "You don't have a choice anymore, Kara," he growled, the endearment sounding like a threat. He hauled me toward the waiting black car, his speed terrifyingly efficient. "You brought my lineage into this world. I will ensure you both are protected, even if I have to break every bone in your body to keep you safe." He wrenched open the back passenger door. I resisted one final, desperate moment, gripping the doorframe, but he simply twisted my arm, forcing a cry of pain from my throat. The darkness of the car's interior yawned open like a waiting tomb. He shoved me inside, the luxurious leather seating cold against my back, and slammed the heavy door shut with a sound of brutal finality. The world outside, the cold stone, the quiet quad, the last vestige of my academic life, vanished behind the tinted glass. Dante slid into the seat beside me, his presence suffocating, his heat overwhelming. The car pulled away instantly, melting into the city traffic, leaving behind nothing but the crumpled test on the pavement and the absolute certainty that I was now caught irrevocably in the dangerous, possessive grip of Dante Moretti. The sleek, obsidian car was a cocoon of expensive silence, yet the air inside vibrated with an electric, terrifying tension. Dante's heat radiated beside me, a solid, suffocating presence that eclipsed the coolness of the leather seats. He hadn't released my arm entirely. His fingers rested just above my elbow, a light weight that somehow felt heavier than chains, a constant, low-level thrum of possession. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of liquid gold and desperate neon, a world I was being violently pulled away from. I stared fixedly out the tinted window, watching the familiar architecture of my city, the Victorian brownstones, the busy corner cafes, the Gothic spires of the university, recede until they were swallowed entirely by darkness. The fear that had been a dull thrumming in my chest now coiled into a tight, sickening knot. Dante drove with a focused, brutal efficiency, navigating increasingly secluded roads. We left behind the sounds of urban life, the distant sirens, the rhythmic drone of traffic, for a heavy, unnatural quiet. The streets grew narrower, the scenery changing from mundane suburban formality to brooding, overgrown wildness. Eventually, the car turned off the main road and onto a winding, private lane shrouded by ancient, skeletal trees whose branches clawed at the fading sky. The transition was abrupt, total. We were leaving civilization. We were entering his domain. When the trees finally parted, the sight that greeted me stole the breath from my lungs and confirmed my worst fears. It was not a house. It was a testament to cold, inherited power, a structure rendered in the most severe Gothic style. The estate rose from the gloom like a monolithic monument, built of black slate and darker gray stone. Gargoyles perched on the eaves, watching the approaching night with stony indifference. Iron gates, scrolled and impossibly high, swung open silently, revealing manicured yet fiercely isolated grounds. The mansion was vast, dwarfing everything around it, its windows dark and recessed, giving the impression of watchful, empty eyes. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly impenetrable, a fortress built for hiding secrets and holding prisoners. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as we pulled up to the massive carved oak doors, which looked capable of withstanding a siege. This was not a home, it was a mausoleum of wealth and secrecy. I was no longer Elena Reyes, the student. I was a cargo, a secret being delivered to its vault. Dante cut the engine, plunging the interior into a sudden, deep quiet that was louder than the engine's roar. The silence was immediately replaced by the pounding of my own heart. I turned on him, the paralysis momentarily eclipsed by a desperate, righteous anger that tasted metallic on my tongue. "This is monstrous," I whispered, my voice trembling but sharp, fueled by the terrifying realization of my confinement. "You have no right. You ripped me out of my life, my future, my education. You think because you're wealthy, because you're who you are, you can simply steal people and their liberty?" He didn't flinch. He merely rested his arm on the back of my seat, leaning closer, his proximity suffocating. "I stole nothing. You endangered what is mine." His voice was low, a dangerous silk, devoid of emotion, but thick with cold conviction. "You ran, Elena. You tried to erase the consequence of our night. You tried to take my son or daughter and vanish into obscurity. That is not merely running from a debt, Kara. That is an act of war in my world. Don't call it war. Don't pretend this is about anything but your cruel, possessive ego." I fought the urge to flinch away from the intensity of his gaze. I was protecting the child from you, from this life, from the very enemies you're so terrified of. "And what is this? Safety?" I gestured wildly at the imposing mansion looming through the windscreen. "It's a prison." "You're terrified of the world you created, so you cage those you claim to protect." Dante sat back slightly, the movement conveying a terrifying, controlled power. "You mistake necessity for cruelty. My world has rules you do not yet comprehend. When a Moretti heir is involved, the risk is absolute. The protection must be absolute. You would have been hunted down, tracked, and used against me, whether you were tucked away in some mountain town or not. I am simply removing the target from the field and placing it in a secure perimeter I control." "So you control me," I finished bitterly, the words tasting like defeat. "You've trapped me." A flicker, something dark and unreadable, passed through his glacial eyes. He reached out, his long fingers tracing the line of my jaw, a touch that was both intimate and utterly controlling. The gesture was a declaration of ownership, not affection. I felt the sharp intake of my own breath, unable to move beneath his scrutiny. "You are carrying my lineage, Elena. You are now the most valuable, and therefore the most vulnerable person in my empire," he stated, his voice dropping to a near whisper that nonetheless carried the weight of a decree. "Do you understand? The perimeter is sealed. The security is absolute. The walls are thick. You will not leave this house until I deem it safe. You will be taken care of, but running is no longer an option." He withdrew his hand, the sudden coolness of the air where he had touched me, emphasizing the chilling finality of his words. He opened his door, the heavy sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. "Welcome home, Elena. You are safe now." I watched him emerge, his silhouette framed against the forbidding stone of the house. He moved with the effortless authority of a king surveying his domain. I looked at the fortress, then at the man who had imprisoned me within it, realizing the walls of his possession were far more terrifying than the stone walls of his estate. I was caught. And the most terrifying realization was that, despite the fear, a small, treacherous part of me recognized the dangerous comfort in being claimed by a force so absolute. The transition from the car's suffocating intimacy to the mansion's interior was a brutal shock of scale. The massive oak doors swung inward, revealing a cavernous hall paved in polished black marble that reflected the dim light like a frozen lake. The air was heavy, dry, and cold, scented not with warmth or life, but with dust, old stone, and the distant, sterile aroma of expensive polish. I felt insignificant, a mote of dust delivered into a gilded prison. Dante's hand remained at my back, urging me forward, a silent, implacable pressure. His presence filled the vast space, lending it a terrible, focused gravity. As we moved, figures emerged from the periphery, house staff moving with the terrifying silence of highly trained phantoms. They wore impeccable black uniforms, their faces pale and unreadable, their gazes fixed firmly on the floor or the middle distance. They moved around Dante as if he were a physical force field, their efficiency sharpened by an obvious, palpable fear. I watched a young woman in a maid's uniform, her eyes wide and fixed, flinch subtly when Dante's shadow passed over her. Their obedience was not loyalty, it was terror. I was led through a series of increasingly formal rooms, drawing rooms heavy with velvet and gold leaf, corridors lined with dark, forbidding portraits of men who looked precisely like Dante, cold, powerful, and demanding. The silence of the house was weighted, a living thing that pressed against my eardrums. Finally, Dante stopped in a room that served as a study, dominated by a vast mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that looked untouched by human hands. He released me, and the sudden absence of his touch left my skin tingling with a cold awareness. I took a shaky breath, determined not to let the architecture of his control break me entirely. "I need my things," I said, forcing the words out, trying to project a semblance of my former self. My voice sounded thin and rebellious in the heavy quiet. My books, my notes, I was in the middle of a semester. I need to continue my studies remotely. Dante settled behind the desk, a king taking his throne. He didn't look up immediately, instead running a long finger over the dark wood. The delay felt calculated, a deliberate erosion of my urgency. When his glacial green eyes finally lifted to meet mine, they held the chilling clarity of absolute denial. "Your education is secondary now, Elena," he stated, his voice low, yet carrying the weight of official dismissal. "Your priority is the health of the heir. Your focus must be internal. However," he conceded, the word a razor's edge, "if you require texts, I will have my staff retrieve anything you specify." You will not communicate with the outside world, and you certainly will not be enrolling in any remote programs. I control the flow of information in and out of this perimeter. You are isolating me, I accused, clutching my arms across my chest. You are systematically stripping away my identity. I am protecting you from distractions and threats, he corrected, leaning forward slightly, the movement conveying predatory focus. This is not a negotiation, Alina. It is a necessary structure. You are now under a regime of absolute control for your own safety. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound folder toward him, opening it with a crisp sound that echoed in the silence. The gesture was bureaucratic, terrifyingly formal. We will establish the rules of the cage immediately. They are non-negotiable. Break them, and the consequences will be severe, not for you, but for the staff who fail to enforce them. The implied threat, the cold willingness to punish others for my defiance, drove a sharp wedge of fear into my throat. I stood immobile, watching him lay out the architecture of my confinement. First, health, he dictated, his eyes scanning the documents. Dr. Rossi, a specialist in high-risk obstetrics, will be visiting 3 times a week. You will follow his instructions to the letter. You will not leave your assigned rooms without an escort. You will take only the prescribed vitamins and supplements. The kitchen staff has been instructed on a specific high-nutrition diet. They will prepare every meal. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. You're restricting my diet? I am perfectly capable of eating properly. You are carrying a Moretti, he said, his tone flat. There will be no risk of deficiency and absolutely no opportunity for you to ingest anything that hasn't been vetted and prepared internally. Consider it a necessary precaution against internal compromise. He paused, and the implication of poisoning hung heavy in the air. Second, movement, he continued, ignoring my horrified expression. Your primary quarters are on the 3rd floor. You may use the adjacent sitting room and the small private balcony, always with the door locked behind you. During daylight hours, you may request access to the formal gardens, accompanied by 2 armed guards, and only when I am on the premises. The one exception to this rule is the library. It is secured, and you may use it unsupervised, provided you inform my staff beforehand. The mention of the library, the sanctuary of my former life, was a strange, bewildering concession. Was this a genuine attempt at comfort, or simply a gilded leash? I will not be treated like a prized animal, I whispered, the exhaustion finally pulling at my resolve. Dante rose, moving around the desk with the silent, dangerous grace of a hunting cat. He stopped inches from me, his height overwhelming, his scent of cedar and cold stone filling my senses. He reached out, his hand lifting my chin, forcing me to meet his stare. You are not an animal, Elena. You are the vessel of my legacy. And yes, you will be prized, watched, and guarded with every resource at my command. Your liberty is a small price to pay for the continuance of my line. Understand this. I am not asking for your compliance. I am demanding it. For the next 7 months, your life is not your own. I followed the butler, my mind reeling. The oppressive weight of the rules settled over me, a tangible cloak of control. The butler led me down a dark, winding staircase and through a vast gallery before halting before a set of towering double doors carved with intricate, scholarly designs. When the doors opened, the sheer size of the library was breathtaking. It was a cathedral of knowledge, 3 stories high, lined with dark wood and filled with thousands upon thousands of books, their spines whispering of forgotten histories. The air here was softer, carrying the musty, comforting scent of aged paper and leather, the only familiar scent in this entire fortress. I walked deeper into the shadowed stacks, running my fingers over the cold bindings, feeling a small, treacherous surge of peace. But even amidst this beautiful, scholarly refuge, the sense of being watched was absolute. The silence was too perfect. The shadows in the high corners were too deep. I looked up at the highest balcony, imagining the glint of a hidden camera lens, or perhaps the cold eyes of a guard who had been told that even in this one sanctioned space, I was never truly alone. I was in a cage built of marble and books, and the rules of my imprisonment had just begun. The night in the Moretti mansion was not quiet. It was a vast, echoing silence punctuated only by the relentless pounding of my own terror. I lay rigid in the heavy, velvet-draped bed, the darkness of the enormous room pressing in on me like physical weight. I was on the 3rd floor, removed and isolated, a priceless artifact locked away in the attic. The air was too cold, too still, scented with expensive, unfamiliar woods and the lingering aroma of old stone. Sometime past 3 in the morning, a sound sliced through the oppressive stillness. It was Dante's voice, low and rough, originating from the adjoining sitting room, the one place he had not yet prohibited me from entering, though I suspected he used it for his own dark business. He must have believed the thick mahogany door and the sheer size of the suite would muffle the sound. I slipped from the bed, the silk nightgown clinging to me, my bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. I moved with a fearful stealth I hadn't known I possessed, drawn irresistibly toward the source of the noise. I pressed my ear against the polished wood of the door, straining to make sense of the hurried, fragmented syllables that dominated his speech. It was Italian, sharp and rapid, laced with an urgency I hadn't heard before. This was not the measured, controlled voice of the captor. This was the voice of the man fighting for his life, stripped bare by necessity. "No, I told you! Secure the perimeter! They are looking for the weakness!" My breath hitched, sharp and painful in my throat. The weakness. He meant me. He meant the child I carried. The euphemism was a cold, brutal assessment of my position. I was not a person. I was a vulnerability, a hinge in his armor that his enemies were already probing. The phrase echoed in the empty spaces of the room, turning my stomach to ice. The conversation continued in furious Italian, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. He was fighting a war, and I was the central, exposed objective. I heard the distinct, chilling mention of a name, a rival family name, harsh and unfamiliar, followed by Dante's definitive, chilling response, once again delivered in a language I understood. "If they touch her, if they even breathe near her, I will burn their history down to ash. Tell them that." The phone slammed down with a violence that resonated through the heavy door. I stumbled back, shaking, the cold marble biting into my feet. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My pregnancy had not merely chained me to Dante, it had painted a massive, glaring target on my abdomen. The walls of this fortress were not built to keep me in alone. They were built to keep the world out, a world that had already decided the easiest way to wound Dante Moretti was through the destruction of his heir and the vessel carrying it. The following morning, the oppressive silence of the house felt like a physical weight on my chest. I felt the urgent need for open air, a craving intensified by the memory of Dante's violent promises echoing through the wall. I requested access to the formal courtyard, citing the necessity of fresh air for the air, a phrase I knew he would respect, a calculated manipulation of his own possessiveness. The walk was an exercise in controlled surveillance. Two massive, silent men, guards whose names I didn't know and whose faces were carved from granite, flanked me. Their presence was a constant, intimidating reminder that I was being watched, managed, and controlled. They led me through a series of grand, echoing hallways until we reached a set of tall glass doors leading to the central cloistered garden. The courtyard was built in the style of an ancient monastery, enclosed by high stone walls draped with heavy, dark ivy. A cold fountain stood at the center, its water still and silent. It was a beautiful space, manicured and orderly, but the high walls made it feel like a deep, expensive pit. I walked slowly along the flagstone path, trying to inhale the damp, earthy scent of the ivy, ignoring the heavy boots of the guards pacing behind me. It was then I saw him. Dante was across the courtyard near a shadowed archway. He was not alone. He stood with three men, clearly senior members of his security detail, who were dressed in severe black suits, holding themselves with military precision. He was not shouting. He was barely moving, but the sheer gravity of his presence pulled the light toward him. He held a small, dark object in his hand, which he gestured with, pointing toward the high wall and then back toward the mansion. I stopped, rooted to the spot, watching the terrifying spectacle of his efficiency. He wasn't the lover, or the angry captor, or the man with the momentary flicker of something broken in his eyes. He was the capo. The authority was absolute, radiating from him like palpable cold, even from this distance. He was giving orders that concerned life and death, and his men absorbed them without question, their expressions vacant of anything but obedience. I saw one of the security men nod sharply, his expression one of total, unquestioning submission. Dante spoke a few low words, too far away to decipher, but the effect on the men was immediate and visceral. They didn't merely agree, they absorbed the command into their very musculature, turning instantly on their heels and moving away to execute the order, their movements swift and silent, like the gears of a deadly machine, like the gears of a deadly machine. He stood there for a moment longer, alone in the archway, framed by the cold stone. He looked utterly isolated, yet completely in control. His power was not derived from wealth or title alone. It was inherent, terrifying, and utterly self-contained. He was the center of a storm, and everything within his orbit was subject to his will. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the courtyard, and for a terrifying second, I thought his eyes landed directly on me, assessing my presence as just another component of his protected inventory. I felt a cold jolt travel down my spine, A primal fear mingled with that dark, sickening admiration for the absolute strength of the man who commanded such loyalty and enforced such brutality. They are looking for the weakness. He was not just my jailer. He was the wall. The realization was chilling in its clarity. Without Dante's terrifying, possessive shield, I was nothing more than a casualty waiting to happen, a pawn to be sacrificed in a war I didn't understand. I had sought to escape his darkness, but the greater darkness was already gathering at the borders of his domain, and only the monstrous efficiency of Dante Moretti could keep it at bay. I was trapped between two dangers, and the one I feared the most was suddenly the only one capable of saving me. The crushing weight of Dante's absolute control, coupled with the chilling knowledge that my life and the life within me was now a prize in a hidden war, made the confines of the main house feel like a suffocating tomb. I needed air, but more than air, I needed space that his rules hadn't yet claimed. I craved the silence of the unknown, the dark corners that hadn't been sanitized by his staff or swept by his watchful eyes. Late one afternoon, while the mansion was plunged into the heavy, echoing quiet that preceded the evening meal, I slipped out of my assigned rooms. My guards were stationed discreetly, but their attention, I knew, was focused primarily on the perimeter and on monitoring the main hallways. They didn't expect defiance in the form of quiet exploration. I followed a narrow service staircase down to the ground floor, emerging into a long, shadowed corridor I had never seen before, clearly part of an older, unused wing. The air here was noticeably cooler, carrying the faint metallic scent of damp stone and forgotten things. The carpet was thick, muffling my steps completely, and the portraits on the walls were dusty, their subjects staring out with expressions of severe disapproval. This felt less like a cage and more like a sepulchre. I moved slowly, running my hand along the cold, carved wainscoting, enjoying the illicit thrill of breaking a rule that Dante had not yet explicitly made. I was navigating the architecture of his past, perhaps touching the edges of a history he kept hidden behind polished marble and modern efficiency. The corridor terminated abruptly at a heavy, unmarked door, slightly ajar, casting a single amber slice of light across the dust-coated floor. Hesitation was replaced by a sharp, irresistible curiosity. I moved to the gap and peered through. This was not the vast, cold study where he held court. This was a smaller, intensely personal space, paneled entirely in dark, ancient cedar, filled with towering stacks of leather-bound books and dominated by a massive, cluttered desk. And Dante was there. He was standing, not sitting, with his back partially to the doorway, leaning heavily on the desk. He hadn't noticed me. He was wearing a dark, open-colored shirt, the usual pristine severity of his clothing slightly rumpled. The light of a single desk lamp pooled around him, isolating him in a golden bubble of stillness. He was utterly, dangerously unguarded. In his hands, he held something small and fragile. I watched, breath held tight in my chest, as he brought the item closer to the light. It was a photograph, faded to sepia, and even from this distance, I could make out the image. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark, intense eyes that were frighteningly similar to Dante's own. The boy was smiling, wide and unrestrained, an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that I realized Dante's face had never possessed. Dante's focus on the image was absolute. His entire body language shifted from the rigid control I was accustomed to. He was motionless, but the stillness was not peace. It was the heavy, deep inertia of internal pain. I saw, for the first time, not the demanding capo or the possessive jailer, but a man haunted by loss. His jaw, usually clenched into granite, was slackened, and his eyes, usually glacial, were shadowed by an overwhelming, visible exhaustion. It was a crack in the fortress, and the sight of it sent a treacherous, sympathetic warmth through the cold armor I wore around my heart. I wanted to retreat, to leave him undisturbed in his private misery, but I stepped forward instead, the floorboards emitting a faint, betraying creak. The effect was instantaneous. Like a snake striking, Dante's body snapped upright, the vulnerability vanishing as if it had been a trick of the light. The photograph was gone, folded or tucked away with a speed that defied observation. His eyes, now hard and sharp, pinned me to the spot. "Elena," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion I had just witnessed. It was a warning, a demand for explanation. I was exploring," I whispered, moving fully into the room, drawn by the residual atmosphere of his pain. "I didn't realize this was private." "Everything outside your designated boundaries is private," he stated, moving to stand between me and the desk, effectively shielding the remnants of his moment of weakness. His hands were now resting lightly on the wood, the picture of measured control. As he shifted, the collar of his shirt, which he had kept meticulously buttoned or tied during every previous encounter, gapped open slightly, pulled taut by the sudden tension in his neck, and there it was. Just below the line of his jaw, partially concealed by the shadow and the fabric, was a scar. It was not a clean surgical line, but a jagged, ugly white track, thick and raised, suggesting a brutal, violent injury. It was old, faded to the color of bone, and yet it felt instantly raw and visceral. My gaze locked onto it, and I felt the blood rush from my face. That single, unveiled mark told a story of suffering and survival far more eloquently than any boast of power. This man had been cleaved, physically broken, and had been forced to rebuild himself into the ruthless entity that stood before me. He noticed the direction of my stare. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and he instinctively raised his hand, touching the edge of the fabric near the scar, a gesture of deep, ingrained secrecy. "Don't look at me like that," he commanded, his voice hardening, pulling back the curtain on the monster. "You misunderstand what you think you see." "I see pain," I countered, the words leaving my mouth before my fear could stop them. "I see something that happened long before you met me." His eyes narrowed, the green depth turning to emerald ice. He looked ready to lash out, to crush the burgeoning empathy that dared to surface between us. But then the fury faltered, replaced by a flicker of something ancient and weary, the ghost of the boy in the photograph. He stepped closer, closing the small, safe distance between us until I was forced to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. His scent, cedar, cold leather, and the unique, sharp aroma of danger enveloped me. "The world is built on violence, Elena. It leaves marks," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that vibrated through the air between us. "Every single act of control you resent, every wall I build around you, is because I know precisely what happens when those walls fail, what happens when the weak are exposed." He wasn't just controlling me. He was shielding me with the same desperate, possessive fury that trauma had carved into his skin and soul. The sight of the scar, the memory of the photograph, they didn't erase the prison, but they provided a terrifying context for the bars. His obsession was not simply lust for ownership. It was a desperate, protective instinct born of a wound that had never truly healed. The air was thick with the silent understanding that passed between us. I was caught, not just by his power, but by the terrible, dangerous realization that I was beginning to feel a profound, unwanted pity for the man who held me captive. That pity was the deadliest weapon of all, blurring the lines between my fear and the treacherous, burgeoning affection that threatened to consume me entirely. The air in the cedar-paneled study had not yet settled from the shock of his vulnerability. The small, ugly scar on Dante's neck, the echo of the lost boy in the sepia photograph, they were shards of light piercing the obsidian wall of his control, and they gave me a terrible, fleeting sense of power. I knew then that I could not fight the monster, but I might be able to negotiate with the man hidden beneath the armor. I took a steadying breath, the scent of aged paper and cold violence filling my lungs. I was still standing just inside the doorway, but I had shed the brittle defiance I had worn for weeks. That stance was useless. I replaced it with the raw, shivering honesty of my fear. "You call me the weakness," I said, my voice barely a rustle in the heavy silence. I watched his face tighten, anticipating the inevitable denial, but I pressed on before he could speak. "You heard me listening at the door the other night. You know what I heard? That they are hunting the vulnerability. I cannot be a passive target, Dante. I cannot survive this war if I am blindfolded." His eyes, dark emeralds sharpened by suspicion, searched mine. He seemed to be weighing the cost of my request against the necessity of my silence. "You want to know who is hunting you?" he finally asked, the question laced with a chilling disbelief that I would dare ask for such dangerous knowledge. "I want to know the shape of the wall you insist on building around me," I countered, stepping closer, until the desk, the physical boundary of his domain, was all that separated us. I am carrying the child. I need to know precisely what kind of danger I must navigate. If I am to trust your protection, I need honesty, not lies about this being temporary, and not silence about the men who want me dead. I articulated my terror, turning it into a demand for intelligence. It was the only currency I possessed. "I am not asking for freedom. I am asking for clarity. Tell me what happens when the walls fail. Tell me who they are and why they believe killing me is the key to destroying you." The tension in the room coiled tighter. For a long, dangerous moment, I thought he would simply seize me, silence me with force, or dismiss me with contempt. But then, the rigidity around his mouth softened, almost imperceptibly, a grudging acknowledgement of the logic beneath my panic. He moved around the desk, deliberately eliminating the physical barrier, until he stood close enough that I could feel the residual heat radiating from his body. "You are right," he murmured, the admission shocking in its unexpected candor. "Ignorance breeds recklessness, and recklessness is unacceptable now." He leaned in, his gaze dropping to the slight curve of my abdomen, a gesture of ownership that was terrifying and strangely reassuring. "The family name you overheard, the ones looking for the weakness, the Volkovs, they operate on the East Coast, old rivals. They believed my organization was vulnerable after the last leadership change. They were wrong, but they see you, Elena. They see the air. They see a target that forces my hand, a distraction that breaks my focus. He spoke the names of his enemies and the inner workings of his dark world as if reciting a ledger, his voice low and devoid of unnecessary emotion. He detailed the perimeters, the structure of his security, the cold, monolithic reality of the protection he had thrown around us. It was a controlled revelation, measured out to give me just enough understanding to cooperate, but not enough to truly comprehend the depth of the abyss we stood over. This was his compromise. He wasn't offering comfort or love. He was offering clarity and structure. He was treating me like a valued, if fragile, asset. And in that terrifying, brutal honesty, I found a dark, precarious kind of safety. "I understand," I whispered, the fear still sharp, but now focused, edged with a terrifying fascination. He had given me a weapon, knowledge. I was no longer fighting shadows. I was fighting the Volkovs, and I was fighting alongside the only man capable of winning that war. The space between us was now charged with the volatile energy of shared, mortal danger. The negotiation was complete, but the emotional exchange had stripped us both bare. The pity I felt for his scar, the grudging respect I held for his efficiency, and the undeniable reality of our intertwined fate converged into a singular, irresistible gravitational pull. He reached out, his hand lifting slowly, deliberately, until his thumb brushed the sensitive skin just below my ear. His touch was heavy, possessive, yet startlingly gentle, a contradiction that defined his very essence. "You asked for honesty, Elena. Here is the final truth. You are mine now, and the threat against you is absolute. Only my control can keep you breathing." His proximity was overwhelming. The shared secret of the scar, the shared knowledge of the impending danger, it acted like an accelerant on the dark attraction I had fought so desperately to suppress. I was no longer looking at my jailer. I was looking at the desperate, wounded man who had built a fortress around me because he knew the true cost of failure. The fear was still there, but it was now laced with a dangerous, intoxicating recognition. I leaned into his touch, a deliberate, high-stakes surrender. "Then protect me, Dante," I whispered, allowing the raw need to surface, accepting the bargain. "Be the wall." The words were a profound, irrevocable commitment, not to love, but to survival, bound by the life growing inside me. The moment the words left my mouth, the careful control that usually encased him shattered. His hand moved, swift and rough, cupping the back of my neck, tilting my head back. His eyes were dark, burning with a victorious, terrifying hunger. "I will be the wall," he vowed, the sound a low, guttural promise that vibrated against my lips. "And you will learn that my sanctuary is absolute." He closed the distance, his mouth descending on mine with a brutal, consuming force that wiped out every thought of caution and retreat. It was not a kiss of romance, but a seal of ownership, a visceral claiming that tasted of cedar, danger, and the metallic tang of inevitable fate. My fear dissolved into a dizzying rush of adrenaline and desperate, responding desire. I clung to him, not out of passion, but out of the primal instinct to merge with the only source of safety in the terrifying world he inhabited. In this dark, secret room, amidst the ghosts of his past and the clear, present danger, I finally surrendered to the man who held both my life and my fear in his powerful, unforgiving hands. my emotional freedom for the guarantee of survival. And in that dangerous exchange, I found myself irreversibly committed to the darkness. The sanctuary was a lie. I had allowed myself to be lulled by the massive, monolithic structure of the mansion, by the thick silence of the expensive walls, and by the terrifying, possessive guarantee of Dante's protection. The compromise we had struck in his cedar-paneled study, my emotional surrender for his absolute defense, had created a fragile bubble of safety that felt now like a cruel joke. I was alone in my room, wrapped in the heavy, velvet quiet of the late afternoon. The lingering physical tension from the previous night, the demanding imprint of Dante's mouth on mine, was a constant, unsettling reminder of the price of my survival. I was resting, trying to breathe past the anxiety that constantly clawed at my chest, when the world outside the gilded cage abruptly fractured. It began not with a bang, but with a structural vibration, a low, deep thud that resonated through the marble floors, followed by the distant, splintering sound of wood giving way. I sat bolt upright, every muscle in my body locking, my hand flying instinctively to the slight, protective curve of my abdomen. A moment of absolute, terrifying silence followed, a charged vacuum before the storm. Then, the sound I had dreaded since Dante first spoke the name Volkov, the sharp, tearing staccato of automatic gunfire. It wasn't distant, it was internal, echoing up the central stairwell like a hideous metallic chorus. The walls had failed. Panic, cold and visceral, seized me. My mind screamed Dante's name, but my body moved on pure survival instinct. I scrambled from the bed, heart hammering against my ribs, the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out all but the loudest, most immediate threats. I couldn't run. I could only hide, become small, invisible. I yanked open the doors of the massive, antique wardrobe, its interior lined with fragrant cedar, an ironic, fleeting memory of the study where I had surrendered. I squeezed myself into the narrow space between Dante's expensive, tailored coats and the inner wall, pulling the heavy velvet doors shut, plunging myself into stifling darkness. The air immediately grew thick and hot, smelling faintly of gunpowder that was already beginning to seep into the ventilation. The chaos intensified. Shouts, harsh, guttural, and not in the measured, familiar tones of Dante's guards, erupted directly below my floor. They were moving fast, efficient. I heard the sickening sound of breaking glass and the unmistakable, heavy thud of a body falling. My breath hitched. A silent, painful sob caught in my throat. I pressed my ear against the wardrobe panel, straining to identify the direction of the threat. Then, the footsteps. Not the measured patrol of security, but heavy, urgent boots on the carpet outside my door. They were searching. They knew where to look. The door to the bedroom burst open with a crash that rattled the wardrobe on its casters. I whimpered, biting down hard on the inside of my cheek to stifle the sound, tasting blood. The intruders were inside the room. I could hear their ragged breathing, the shifting of weapons, the low, rapid exchange of foreign words I didn't understand. They were close enough that I could smell the cold, damp air they carried in, mixed with fear and the sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood. "Cercatela," a voice hissed, loud and urgent, confirming the chilling truth. They were here for me. The vulnerability, the weakness. A beam of light sliced through the crack at the base of the wardrobe doors. I froze, rigid, praying that the darkness and the sheer bulk of the furniture would protect me. I heard the frantic rustle of linens as they checked under the bed, the violent scrape of furniture being pushed aside. Just as the footsteps approached the heavy wooden doors of my hiding place, the atmosphere in the room changed again, violently. The air seemed to compress, and a sound like a roar, a sound that was pure, unrestrained, predatory fury, erupted in the doorway. Dante. He didn't announce his presence with a shout or a warning. He arrived in a devastating burst of brutal efficiency. The sounds that followed were horrifyingly swift, a sharp, sickening crack, followed by a muffled cry of pain, and then the deafening, close-range report of a pistol. Once, twice, final. The air in the room shuddered, and I felt the heavy thump of a body collapsing directly against the wardrobe, jarring my shoulder. I heard the quick, rhythmic sound of metal striking flesh, the grunt of effort, and the harsh, ragged breathing of a man fighting for his life. The violence was immediate, intimate, and absolutely terrifying. I didn't see him, but I saw the effects of his presence, the sudden, desperate, terrified retreat of the remaining intruders, cut short by the cold, surgical repetition of gunfire. He was a force of nature, a maelstrom of destruction aimed solely at my defense. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming silently down my face, overwhelmed not just by fear, but by the terrifying, undeniable reassurance of his ferocity. This was the wall I had asked for. This was the monster I had compromised with. The sounds stopped, leaving behind a ringing silence, thick with the smell of scorched earth and blood. The stillness was heavier, more profound than before the attack, saturated now with death. "Elena," his voice cut through the silence, sharp and raw, stripped of all artifice. It was a command, not a question. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, a shivering, fetal mass hidden among the dark coats. The wardrobe doors were thrown open with such force that they struck the walls. Light flooded in, blinding me. I looked up, blinking, into the face of a stranger. Dante stood there, magnificent and terrifying. His suit was dark with moisture, his knuckles scraped raw, and his eyes, those fathomless green eyes, were blazing with a cold, murderous intensity I had never witnessed before. He looked like an avenging angel carved from obsidian. He didn't speak again. He simply reached in, his hands strong and certain, hauling me out of the suffocating space and into the chaos he had just mastered. I stumbled against him, catching my foot on something soft and heavy on the floor. I didn't look down. His arms locked around me, possessive and crushing. "Did they touch you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl against my hair, checking me for wounds with frantic, rough urgency. "Did they hurt the child?" I shook my head, unable to form words, clinging to the hard, unyielding reality of his body. The fear was still a living thing inside me, but it was overshadowed by a profound, chilling recognition. I was safe, not because the mansion was secure, but because Dante Moretti was a harbinger of death, and he had aimed his lethal efficiency at my enemies. I looked at the wreckage of the room, the splintered door, the crimson smears on the ivory walls, the dark, still shapes that lay scattered on the carpet, the physical evidence of the violence enacted for my sake. I saw the cold, brutal commitment etched onto Dante's face. He was not just a powerful man. He was a weapon, and I was irrevocably linked to its terrible purpose. The walls had failed, but the monster had not. In that moment of visceral, horrifying clarity, the last shred of my former life dissolved. I was no longer an independent student trapped in a bad situation. I was Dante's property, the carrier of his air, and my existence was now defined by the lethal, brooding shadows he commanded. My life belonged irrevocably and absolutely to the darkness. The air in the bedroom was still heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of gunfire. Dante's arms, though no longer crushing, remained around me, a rigid cage of muscle and certainty. I could feel the frantic, uneven rhythm of his heart against my temple, a sound that was both violently human and terrifyingly primal. He was not merely a man, he was a crucible of violence, forged in the very darkness he now sheltered me within. I pushed back gently, needing space not to run, but to breathe the air of this new, chilling reality. My former self, the student who worried about late assignments and cafe shifts, was dead, strangled by the immediate, visceral truth of the attack. They had breached the walls. They had come for the weakness, and only the monster had stood between the blade and my child. I looked at the shattered door, at the smears of crimson against the expensive wallpaper, and felt a cold, terrifying clarity settle over me. There was no life to return to. The illusion of my independent future, the dream of raising this child in the mundane safety of the outside world, had been torn to shreds alongside the velvet curtains. If I fled, the Volkovs would find me. If I hid, they would hunt. The only sanctuary was this man, this possessive, dangerous shadow who treated my survival as an extension of his own sovereignty. I stepped away from him, ignoring the immediate tension that coiled in his posture at the movement. My hands were shaking, but my gaze was steady, fixed on his face, which was still etched with the cold fury of the recent fight. He waited, silent, watching me with the predatory patience of a man who knew he had just proved his ultimate worth. "Where are you going?" he finally demanded, his voice low, rough, edged with the exhaustion of combat. "I am going where I need to be," I answered, the words sounding alien and resolute. I turned toward the doorway, stepping carefully over the debris of the attack, and walked out of the wreckage of my room. I found him moments later in the central security hub, a sterile, technological cave hidden behind the library, a stark contrast to the Gothic opulence of the main house. He was speaking rapid, curt commands into a headset, his back rigid, his attention divided between me and the screens displaying the perimeter. He had already changed his shirt, but a dark line of dried blood still tracked along his jawline, a silent testament to the price of my defense. I waited until he finished his call, the silence in the small room broken only by the low hum of electronics. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine, dark, assessing, expecting fear or perhaps a renewed plea for escape. Instead, he found only a fierce, cold determination that mirrored his own. "The bargain we made in the study," I began, my voice clear despite the tremor deep in my chest. "The one where I accepted your wall, your honesty, and your control in exchange for survival." He inclined his head, a gesture of grudging acknowledgement. It was necessary. It remains necessary. "No," I corrected, stepping closer, until the space between us was charged with the volatile energy of our shared fate. It is no longer a necessity born of fear. It is a choice. I took a deep breath, allowing the truth to settle, heavy and irreversible. I saw what happened here, Dante. I heard them. They were hunting us. They were hunting the child. I understand now that the moment I conceived, I forfeited the right to a normal life. There is no freedom for me, not anymore, not while I carry the heir to your darkness. I let the words hang there. Your darkness. I was naming the shadow, claiming it, accepting the possessive, brutal reality of his world. I wasn't running from the monster. I was choosing to stand beside him. You asked me to trust your protection, I continued, my voice firming. I trust your ruthlessness. I trust that you will kill anyone who threatens the life inside me. I am done fighting the prison, Dante. I am choosing the wall. His green eyes darkened, shifting from suspicion to a deep, consuming intensity that was far more terrifying than his fury. He didn't smile, but a profound, chilling satisfaction radiated off him, warming the cold dread in my own soul. It was the look of a predator whose coveted possession had finally, willingly settled into his grasp. He lifted a hand, tracing the faint tremor beneath my collarbone with the calloused pad of his thumb. The gesture was slow, deliberate, marking me as his own. "You surrender," he murmured, the words not a question, but a confirmation of his ultimate victory. "I align," I corrected, tilting my chin slightly. "I align myself with the only power capable of keeping us alive. I am not a victim anymore, Dante. I am the mother of your child, and if this child is destined to inherit your shadow, then I will learn how to wield it." The control he usually maintained, that monolithic composure, flickered, revealing the dangerous, hungry man beneath. He closed the remaining distance, his body pressing against mine, a heavy, solid anchor. He didn't kiss me this time. Instead, he simply rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm and uneven. "You will never regret this choice, Elena," he promised, his voice a low, vibrating vow that seemed to seal the fate of my soul. "I will make this sanctuary absolute. You will belong to the shadow, and the shadow will belong to you." He drew back, but kept his grip firm on my arms, turning us slowly toward the window that overlooked the estate's vast, manicured grounds. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds, shrouding the world in a deep, impenetrable gloom. The house, usually a monument of quiet wealth, now felt like a fortress, silent and watchful, humming with the invisible threat it had just repelled. Standing there, shoulder to shoulder, gazing out at the brooding landscape, I felt the possessiveness of his proximity settle not as a burden, but as a terrifying shield. I was no longer looking for an escape route. I was looking for the enemy. I had accepted the darkness, trading the illusion of freedom for the ferocious, possessive love of a monster. And in that irrevocable moment, standing beside the man who had ordered deaths in my defense, I knew I had finally chosen the only path left to me, the shadow.